August 1945. The war was over, but the silence fell heavier than any bombing run. On the edge of Retsuji Air Base, a group of Japanese pilots stepped down from a rusted truck. Their flight suits hung loose. The wings stitched to their chests now felt like relics from another world. Before them stood a row of sleek, silver machines, untouched by war's exhaustion. The sunlight caught the polished metal skins of the American aircraft, P-51 Mustangs, F-6F Hellcats, and the massive shadow of AB-29 Superfortress looming like a monument to victory. For years, these shapes had filled their gun sights, swift, invincible, merciless. Now they stood silent, their propellers still, guarded not by soldiers but by quiet respect. An American officer gestured for them to come closer. Hesitant steps echoed on the hangar floor. One of the former Zero pilots, barely 20, reached out and laid his hand on the cold fuselage of the plane that once hunted him over the Pacific. He whispered nothing. He didn't need to. The metal spoke for itself. The story of how a nation's pride met the unstoppable tide of industrial might. By the closing months of 1944, Japan's skies had become graveyards of smoke and shattered wings. What began as a campaign of conquest in 1941 had turned into a desperate fight for survival. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force and the Imperial Navy Air Service, once feared across the Pacific, were being methodically dismantled by American power. In the early years of the war, Japan's pilots had dominated. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 was fast, agile, and lethal. Over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Coral Sea, it cut through Allied squadrons with frightening precision. Many American and British pilots nicknamed the Zero the Ghost because it seemed untouchable. But by 1943, the tide had shifted. The United States had learned quickly, adapting, industrializing, and innovating with a scale Japan could never match. New American aircraft emerged from vast assembly lines in California and Texas every hour. P-38 Lightnings with turbocharged engines. F-6F Hellcats that could absorb punishment and still fly home. The F-4U Corsair, fast, powerful, brutally efficient. And by 1944, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang changed everything. It could escort bombers deep into Japanese territory, fly faster and higher than almost anything Japan could send against it, and return safely to base. Meanwhile, Japan's resources were collapsing. Fuel reserves had dwindled to a fraction of what was needed. Training programs for new pilots were reduced to weeks instead of months. The veterans, the elite who had fought since China and Midway, were dying faster than they could be replaced. What filled the cockpits now were boys barely trained, sent aloft with dreams of honor and almost no chance of return. By the summer of 1944, U.S. bombers ruled the sky. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, an engineering marvel of aluminum and fire, carried the war to Japan's heart. From the Marianas, they struck Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Each mission brought hundreds of planes, flying higher than Japanese interceptors could reliably reach. Below, cities vanished in oceans of flame. The Japanese aircraft industry, once proud and resourceful, began to disintegrate. Airfields were bombed daily. Factories producing engines, propellers, and ammunition were reduced to rubble. Engineers tried to design newer models, the Nakajima Ki-84 the Kawanishi N1 Keishirden, even experimental jets, but shortages of materials and fuel crippled production. The air battles became suicidally one-sided. U.S. Navy Hellcats shot down Japanese planes at a ratio of nearly 12-1. Pilots described the once deadly Zero as fragile, outdated, and burning at a glance. For many Japanese airmen, fly became an act of sacrifice rather than victory. They fought on not for strategic success, but for a dying sense of duty. In command centers across Japan, leaders watched as the skies turned against them. They could no longer hide the truth. Japan had lost control of the air. American planes could strike anywhere, anytime. And when they appeared, nothing on earth could stop them. By early 1945, the psychological toll was devastating. Every pilot who returned from a mission carried the same haunted look, the realization that their beloved aircraft, their nation's symbols of pride, had become relics of another era. And yet, Even amid destruction, Japan's pilots kept flying. They believed their sacrifice would protect their homeland. The rising sun still painted their wings each morning, but beneath it, the empire was crumbling. As the smoke thickened over the Pacific, a new reality emerged. The Americans were not only winning through courage or tactics, they were winning through science, industry, and relentless innovation. Machines had become the true victors of the sky. And soon, those very machines, the ones that brought Japan to its knees, would stand face to face with the men who once tried to destroy them. T-Moment began a new chapter, not combat, but of understanding. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, its airfields were silent wastelands. Charred runways, shattered hangars, and the twisted remains of thousands of aircraft. The once proud wings of the empire lay scattered across the homeland and the Pacific Islands. But amid this devastation, another force was moving quietly. The American Technical Air Intelligence Units, TAUs. Formed during the war, these specialized teams of U.S. pilots, engineers, and analysts had one mission: to find, capture, and study enemy aircraft. What had begun as a secret effort in the jungles of New Guinea and the Philippines now expanded into a massive post-war operation across Japan itself. The Americans wanted to know everything: what the Japanese had built, how they had built it, and why it had failed. Across air bases from Atsugi to Yokosuka, captured aircraft were lined up, tagged, and cataloged. Zeros, Ki-43s, Ride interceptors, and Shidenkai fighters were gathered like fallen trophies of technology. Engineers carefully measured wing shapes, engine compression ratios, and propeller pitches. Many aircraft were shipped to the United States for testing at Wright Field and NAS Patuxent River. But the process wasn't only about machines. It was about understanding the minds that designed and flew them. In the early weeks of the occupation, American officers began interviewing Japanese pilots, engineers, and commanders. Many were astonished by how openly some of the former enemy cooperated. Years of propaganda had painted the Americans as monsters. But now, on the ground, the victors behaved with unexpected restraint. They asked questions, not vengeance. They offered cigarettes, sometimes even food. At certain bases, former Japanese aviators were quietly allowed to observe the captured aircraft that had destroyed their fleets. Some were invited to assist in identifying models, explaining tactics, or translating technical manuals. For the first time, they could walk around American P-51 or F-6F Hellcat, machines that had haunted their skies. To many, it was an encounter that struck deeper than humiliation. It was a revelation of how wide the technological gap had become. They saw it in the details: the thicker armor plating, the self-sealing fuel tanks, the powerful radios, the precision of manufacturing. Every rivet spoke of industrial might and methodical design. Compared to the handcrafted beauty of the Zero, these American aircraft were cold, efficient, and built by the thousands. One Japanese engineer later recalled, "We built our planes like swords. They built theirs like machines." The Americans, too, were surprised. They found remarkable ingenuity in Japanese designs, clever aerodynamic concepts, lightweight materials, and meticulous craftsmanship. But the lack of strategic resources and standardization had doomed the effort. Japan's industry could produce masterpieces, but not mass production. As these quiet exchanges unfolded in hangars across Japan, the atmosphere shifted from hostility to curiosity. For some Japanese pilots, seeing the aircraft that had defeated them was painful. For others, it was strangely inspiring. They realized that the Americans had not relied on luck or numbers alone. They had mastered a system of innovation, coordination, and logistics that Japan had never achieved. By late 1945, the occupation forces were systematically dismantling Japan's military institutions. The Imperial Japanese Army, Air Force, and Navy Air Service were officially disbanded. Weapons were confiscated, aircraft destroyed, or shipped overseas for study. But amid the ashes of defeat, the seeds of future cooperation were quietly being sown. American engineers shared insights, Japanese technicians observed, and both sides, once mortal enemies, began to recognize in each other the same fascination with flight. That delicate bridge of understanding, built in silence among wrecked machines, would soon define a new era for Japanese aviation, because what began as surrender would, in time, evolve into rebirth, a transformation that neither side could yet imagine. The human angle, silence among the machines. The first time the Japanese pilots saw the American aircraft up close, they said nothing. Words would have been meaningless before such overwhelming evidence of defeat. At Atsugi, Yokota, and other occupied airfields, groups of former Imperial aviators were escorted under guard to help identify wrecked Japanese planes and examine captured U.S. models. The Americans needed their technical input, names, performance data, maintenance notes. But what those men encountered went far beyond engineering. They walked through vast hangars where American planes gleamed under floodlights. The P-51 Mustang, with its smooth laminar flow wings and the deep growl of its Packard-built Merlin engine, stood like a creature of another age. Nearby, the F-6F Hellcat, heavier, more brutal, seemed designed for survival, not elegance. For pilots who had flown the light, Nimble Zero, these machines felt alien. One former naval pilot later recalled the moment he touched the riveted skin of a Hellcat. It was like feeling the wall of a fortress. Our planes were thin and alive. This one was hard, cold, indestructible. To the Americans, the Japanese looked like ghosts of the very war they had ended. Some were thin from malnutrition, their uniforms faded, their eyes hollow. Yet even in defeat there was dignity, an unspoken respect between professionals who had once tried to kill each other thousands of feet above the sea. An American flight officer from the Technical Air Intelligence Unit noted in his diary that the Japanese handled every airplane as though it were sacred, ours or theirs. They asked questions in broken English, comparing throttle responses, gun placements, and oxygen systems. When told that the P-51 could escort bombers from Iwo Jima all the way to Tokyo and back, a Japanese pilot simply lowered his head. He didn't doubt it anymore. He had seen those same Mustangs die from the clouds like falcons. The exchange was quiet, often wordless, but deeply human. In those hangars, the boundaries between enemy and engineer began to blur. The war was finished. Curiosity had survived. The tactical angle, the sky as a teacher. In the final years of the Pacific War, American pilots learned quickly and brutally how to fight their Japanese counterparts. By 1942, early battles over the Coral Sea and Midway had exposed the strengths and weaknesses of the Japanese Zero. It was light, agile, and devastating in a turning fight, but lacked armor and power in dives. American tacticians adapted, writing new doctrines based on cold observation rather than emotion. From those lessons came the boom and zoom strategy: never dogfight, never circle. Strike once with superior speed, then climb away to safety. The Hellcat and the Corsair became the perfect tools for that method. Their massive engines and heavy frames could survive hits that would shatter a Zero in seconds. While Japan's pilots clung to the chivalric style of one-on-one combat, the Americans turned the air war into mathematics. Fuel range, altitude, dive angle, ammunition count. Efficiency replaced honor as the principle of survival. By 1944, that doctrine had reached perfection. U.S. Navy fighters operated as teams, guided by radar and radio. They no longer hunted blindly. Information flowed from ships to squadrons in real time, giving Americans a vision of the battlefield Japan could never achieve. To the Japanese, this invisible network seemed like sorcery. In reality, it was simply the power of coordination. The same industrial discipline that produced their enemies' planes also shaped their tactics. When the captured pilots later saw the cockpit radios, radar indicators, and oxygen systems of American aircraft, many finally understood why the skies had become impossible to reclaim. It wasn't just the planes. It was a system. Japan's air war had been fought by brave men and beautiful machines, but had been lost by a nation that never built the infrastructure to support modern combat. Those hangar visits after the war, silent and humbling, were like classrooms without teachers. Every rivet, every dial, every inch of metal told the story of tactical evolution. The Americans had learned from every mistake. The Japanese had repeated theirs. For those who survived, that realization was not bitter. It was instructive. Many would later apply those lessons when Japan was reborn under peace. The moral and leadership angle. Respect and defeat. War strips away illusions, but sometimes it reveals unexpected truths. among both American and Japanese aviators. There grew a quiet respect, not for ideology, but for courage. During the occupation, reports from the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces described Japanese officers as disciplined, intelligent, and shockingly humble. The men who once shouted battle cries for the emperor now bowed deeply, not from fear, but from an ingrained sense of duty. They followed orders even in surrender. For the Americans who met them, it was disorienting. Many had lost friends to kamikaze attacks, the most extreme symbol of fanaticism. Yet here stood the same pilots, calm, polite, eager to help dismantle the very system that once demanded their lives. It forced the victors to see their enemies not as monsters, but as men who had obeyed the machinery of their nation. In these post-war exchanges, leadership was redefined. On both sides, a quiet professionalism replaced propaganda. U.S. officers often commented that Japanese aviators displayed a gentleman's discipline, even in ruin. For the Japanese, the Americans' willingness to share knowledge, rather than impose humiliation, left a lasting impression. One former naval pilot later recalled the moment he touched the riveted skin of a Hellcat. It was like feeling the wall of a fortress. Our planes were thin and alive. This one was hard, cold, indestructible. To the Americans, the Japanese looked like ghosts of the very war they had ended. Some were thin from malnutrition, their uniforms faded, their eyes hollow. Yet even in defeat there was dignity, an unspoken respect between professionals who had once tried to kill each other thousands of feet above the sea. An American flight officer from the Technical Air Intelligence Unit noted in his diary that the Japanese handled every airplane as though it were sacred, ours or theirs. They asked questions in broken English, comparing throttle responses, gun placements, and oxygen systems. When told that the P-51 could escort bombers from Iwo Jima all the way to Tokyo and back, a Japanese pilot simply lowered his head. He didn't doubt it anymore. He had seen those same Mustangs dive from the clouds like falcons. The exchange was quiet, often wordless, but deeply human. In those hangars, the boundaries between enemy and engineer began to blur. The war was finished. Curiosity had survived. The tactical angle, the sky as a teacher. In the final years of the Pacific War, American pilots learned quickly and brutally how to fight their Japanese counterparts. By 1942, early battles over the Coral Sea and Midway had exposed the strengths and weaknesses of the Japanese Zero. It was light, agile, and devastating in a turning fight, but lacked armor and power in dives. American tacticians adapted, writing new doctrines based on cold observation rather than emotion. From those lessons came the boom and zoom strategy: never dogfight, never circle. Strike once with superior speed, then climb away to safety. The Hellcat and the Corsair became the perfect tools for that method. Their massive engines and heavy frames could survive hits that would shatter a Zero in seconds. While Japan's pilots clung to the chivalric style of one-on-one combat, the Americans turned the air war into mathematics. Fuel range, altitude, dive angle, ammunition count. Efficiency replaced honor as the principle of survival. By 1944, that doctrine had reached perfection. U.S. Navy fighters operated as teams, guided by radar and radio. They no longer hunted blindly. Information flowed from ships to squadrons in real time, giving Americans a vision of the battlefield Japan could never achieve. To the Japanese, this invisible network seemed like sorcery. In reality, it was simply the power of coordination. The same industrial discipline that produced their enemies' planes also shaped their tactics. When the captured pilots later saw the cockpit radios, radar indicators, and oxygen systems of American aircraft, many finally understood why the skies had become impossible to reclaim. It wasn't just the planes, it was a system. Japan's air war had been fought by brave men and beautiful machines, but had been lost by a nation that never built the infrastructure to support modern combat. Those hangar visits after the war, silent and humbling, were like classrooms without teachers. Every rivet, every dial, every inch of metal told the story of tactical evolution. The Americans had learned from every mistake. The Japanese had repeated theirs. For those who survived, that realization was not bitter. It was instructive. Many would later apply those lessons when Japan was reborn under peace. The moral and leadership angle. respect and defeat. War strips away illusions, but sometimes it reveals unexpected truths. Among both American and Japanese aviators, there grew a quiet respect, not for ideology, but for courage. During the occupation, reports from U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces described Japanese officers as disciplined, intelligent, and shockingly humble. The men who once shouted battle cries for the emperor now bowed deeply, not from fear, but from an ingrained sense of duty. They followed orders even in surrender. For the Americans who met them, it was disorienting. Many had lost friends to kamikaze attacks, the most extreme symbol of fanaticism. Yet here stood the same pilots, calm, polite, eager to help dismantle the very system that once demanded their lives. It forced the victors to see their enemies not as monsters, but as men who had obeyed the machinery of their nation. In these post-war exchanges, leadership was redefined. On both sides, a quiet professionalism replaced propaganda. U.S. officers often commented that Japanese aviators displayed a gentleman's discipline, even in ruin. For the Japanese, the Americans' willingness to share knowledge, rather than impose humiliation, left a lasting impression. One moment, recorded by a Navy interpreter at Yokosuka in late 1945, captured this transformation perfectly. A Japanese squadron leader stood before an American colonel as they examined a damaged P-51. The Japanese officer bowed and said to the interpreter, "This plane killed my best friend, but it is a beautiful thing." The colonel paused, then replied simply, "He must have been a good pilot to make you say that." It was a brief, human connection, a recognition that both had served something larger than themselves, and both had paid dearly for it. Leadership in that moment was not about command. It was about acknowledgement. The Americans led by restraint, the Japanese by humility. Out of that fragile understanding, the groundwork was laid for a new relationship that would soon turn enemies into allies. In the years ahead, these same pilots, engineers, and officers, once bound by hatred, would become collaborators in Japan's reconstruction. The knowledge that had once divided them would now unite them in rebuilding an entire nation's aviation legacy. But before that could happen, there was one final chapter, the desperate climax of a dying empire's last stand in the skies. The idea had begun in late 1944, when Vice Admiral Takejiro Nishi proposed organized suicide attacks to halt the American advance toward the Philippines. "One plane for one ship," he said. It was not madness. It was calculation born from hopeless arithmetic. Japan had neither the fuel nor the numbers to fight conventionally. The only weapon left was a human spirit. Across airfields from Kyushu to Okinawa, young pilots wrote farewell letters and painted rising suns on their headbands. Many had logged fewer than 40 flight hours. They knew their planes, mostly outdated Zeros or repurposed trainers, could not outfly the new American fighters. But their mission no longer depended on survival. It depended on impact. When Operation Kikusui launched in April 1945, waves of kamikazes filled the southern sky. They dove toward the vast U.S. invasion fleet off Okinawa with chilling determination. American radar operators watched the screens blur with incoming dots. Anti-aircraft guns thundered. Tracer rounds stitched the horizon, and flames rained from the clouds. The attacks inflicted terrible damage. Dozens of U.S. ships were hit. More than 4,900 sailors were killed. But the American fleet did not retreat. Each strike only hardened its resolve. Hellcats and Corsairs rose in relentless defense, cutting down kamikazes by the hundreds. What the Japanese command had called divine wind was, in truth, the last storm of a dying force. Up above, the difference between the two air powers had never been clearer. American pilots flew modern, radio-coordinated formations. They communicated across miles, adjusting tactics mid-battle. Japanese flyers often launched in isolation, guided by intuition and fate. Once they left the ground, they were alone, their radios weak, their intelligence outdated, their chances almost non-existent. For many survivors on both sides, Okinawa became the symbol of finality. American pilots described skies filled with burning aircraft, oil streaming down into the sea. Japanese commanders, watching from coastal observation posts, saw the last remnants of their air arm vanish one by one. By May, fuel shortages grew catastrophic. Some kamikaze planes were towed by trucks to save the last drops of gasoline for takeoff. Engines coughed and died before reaching altitude. Mechanics wept openly as their machines failed before even meeting the enemy. And still, they tried again. It was courage without hope, a kind of defiance that even American officers later admitted they could not entirely condemn. Admiral Chester Nimitz, after the war, remarked privately that the kamikazes had fought with a bravery that should have served a better cause. In the skies, the P-51 Mustangs now appeared daily, escorting B-29 bombers from Iwo Jima to the Japanese mainland. Their silver wings gleamed in formation, engines steady and confident. Below them, the final fragment of Japan's once mighty Air Force scrambled to meet them, knowing the outcome was already written. Dogfights turned into executions. The Japanese pilots, some flying without landing gear to save weight, attacked from every angle, often alone. For them, the war was not a contest of weapons anymore. It was a ritual of duty. But for the Americans, it was a demonstration of mastery. Every engagement reaffirmed how far technology, training, and coordination had carried them. On April 16, 1945, AB-29 crew recorded seeing a Lone Zero diving through their formation at impossible speed. The plane missed, spiraled out of control, and exploded against the waves. In the gunner's log, one line was written simply, "Even now they do not stop." That line captured the war's essence in its final months. One side fighting with unshakable will, the other with unstoppable means. By July, Japan's airfields were graveyards. Thousands of aircraft sat crippled, unfueled, or destroyed. The once invincible air arm that had opened the war with Pearl Harbor was now reduced to silence. Only the shrill whine of incoming B-29s broke the stillness. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no Japanese fighters rose to intercept them. There were no pilots left, no fuel, and no reason. The sky itself had surrendered. But for those who survived, the few pilots, engineers, and officers who lived through that ruin, one final shock awaited. They would soon see, touch, and study the very machines that had ended their empire from above. The pilots who survived, scattered across the homeland in caves, on remote bases, were ordered to cease all flights. Some wept openly on the tarmac. Others sat in their cockpits, unwilling to leave, their hands resting on the controls, as if letting go would erase who they were. To fly had been their purpose, their identity. Now, even the sky belonged to someone else. When the Americans arrived, they came not as avengers, but as architects of order. General Douglas MacArthur's forces moved with precision, securing airfields and collecting documents. Among them were the specialists of the Technical Air Intelligence Units, trained to recover every scrap of aviation data from the defeated enemy. At Atsugi, the first major airfield to fall under Allied control, the encounter was surreal. Japanese pilots, still wearing their insignia, were instructed to assist in identifying aircraft types and technical manuals. The Americans treated them with measured professionalism, almost curiosity. The tension in those first moments was unbearable, until one small gesture changed the atmosphere. An American ground officer, seeing a Japanese pilot struggling to translate a flight manual, offered him his cigarette lighter. The man bowed, accepted it, and returned it with both hands, a gesture of deep respect. In that instant, hostility gave way to something human. Soon, groups of former Japanese airmen were escorted through hangars lined with American aircraft flown in for demonstration. P-51 Mustangs with their mirror-polished skins, F-6F Hellcats scarred from battle, and B-29s looming like metallic leviathans. The very planes that filled their nightmares now stood within reach. Many pilots could not hide their awe. They walked slowly, tracing the metal seams with their fingers, whispering to one another in disbelief. To see these machines up close was to finally understand what they had been fighting against, not merely men, but a civilization of machinery. The Americans invited them to observe demonstrations. At Yokosuka, engineers ran engine tests on a Hellcat before a silent crowd of Japanese airmen. When the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine roared to life, its power shook the hangar. The Japanese pilots instinctively stepped back, shielding their faces from the blast of exhaust. Some smiled faintly, others stared, expressionless, absorbing the truth. It was not humiliation they felt. It was recognition. A few days later, American officers brought captured Zeros to the same airfield for side-by-side comparison. The difference was staggering. Thinner metal, lighter frame, no armor. For years, the Japanese had believed their craftsmanship and courage would balance that equation. Standing before both aircraft now, even the most loyal officers could see that courage alone had never been enough. Reports from the time describe a somber curiosity in these exchanges. The Americans noted how carefully the Japanese handled every airplane, whether friend or foe. They touched them like altars, one U.S. pilot wrote, as if the spirit of every dead comrade still lived inside the wings. For the Americans, too, the moment carried weight. Many of them had fought these same men months earlier over the Pacific. Seeing their former enemies humble, cooperative, and disciplined stirred conflicting emotions: respect, relief, even pity. In one recorded instance at Tsuji, a Japanese flight instructor approached an American Mustang pilot and bowed deeply. Through a translator, he said, "We never understood how you turned and climbed at such speed. Now I see it. Your engines breathe differently." The American nodded quietly. There was no need for pride. Both men knew what that difference had cost. That day, the airfield became something more than a place of surrender. It became a classroom, a bridge between two worlds once locked in annihilation. The Americans shared their manuals and data. The Japanese offered insights into captured aircraft and their wartime innovations. Mutual curiosity replaced hostility. In the following weeks, the Japanese pilots were disbanded. Their uniforms were taken, their wings removed. But in those final encounters with American aircraft, they witnessed something extraordinary. Not only the tools that had defeated them, but the future that could yet emerge from defeat. They saw that power was not magic. It was discipline, design, cooperation, qualities that could be learned. And as the occupation deepened, that understanding began to take root. For while Japan's skies had fallen silent, a new era of engineering and partnership was about to begin, one that would turn the lessons of destruction into the foundation of rebirth. The weeks following Japan's surrender were marked by an almost sacred quiet. For the first time in more than a decade, no engines tore through the morning sky. Across the islands, runways once alive with activity turned into graveyards of steel and silence. Rows of aircraft, Zeros, Raiden Interceptors, Ki, 84 Hayats, sat abandoned beneath the open sky, their wings collecting dust, their fuel drained by occupying forces. At Atsugi and Yokosuka, where the final surrender of Japan's air power took place, the atmosphere was haunting. The airfields that had once symbolized Japan's reach now became monuments to what was lost. American flags fluttered over hangars where the rising sun had once flown. The same tarmac that saw pilots depart for suicide missions now hosted U.S. trucks, unloading crates of equipment, manuals, and typewriters. But beneath the stillness, a strange new rhythm began. The Americans, ever methodical, turned the remnants of Japan's aviation might into laboratories of learning. Former imperial engineers, once sworn to secrecy and service, were now asked to explain, document, and demonstrate. They dismantled engines for Allied technicians, translated research papers, and reconstructed aircraft under supervision. What had been weapons of pride were now tools of study. Among the Japanese, this process stirred complex emotions. For the pilots, many of whom had lost everything, comrades, families, even the purpose that had defined their lives, there was a quiet reckoning. They walked the airfields in civilian clothes, their eyes following every American plane that roared overhead. The sound no longer inspired hatred, only reflection. One American officer wrote in his diary, "They stand beside us as we test their planes, expressionless but dignified. They never turn away. I think they want to understand, not just surrender." In the small towns near these bases, children began to approach American soldiers, fascinated by their cameras and candy. Women traded rice and fabric for cigarettes and soap. The occupation, though tense, unfolded with less violence than anyone expected. Mutual curiosity softened the edges of defeat. And for Japan's engineers, curiosity became a kind of salvation. Men from Mitsubishi, Nakajima, and Kawanishi, the same companies that had built Japan's legendary warplanes, were quietly reabsorbed into civilian life. When MacArthur's administration lifted industrial restrictions a few years later, those same minds would become the architects of Japan's rebirth in technology and aviation. But in 1945, that future was invisible. For the men who had flown, there was only the present. A country in ruins, a sky stripped of meaning. Some refused to accept it. In remote hangars, a few pilots hid their aircraft, hoping one day Japan might rise again. 1-0 was discovered months later, perfectly maintained, its fuel preserved, its pilot missing. Others turned to farming, their hands clumsy on plows instead of control sticks. In Tokyo, a small exhibition of captured Allied planes drew crowds. For civilians who had spent years under bombardment, seeing AB-29 up close was like standing before a god. The immense size, the mechanical precision, the confidence of its design, it was both terrifying and inspiring. Journalist accounts from the time note a recurring phrase among Japanese visitors. So this is what we fought against. In that phrase lay the seed of change. The war had ended not simply in defeat, but in revelation, a confrontation with the modern world. As months passed, American aircraft continued to dominate Japanese skies, but now as symbols of occupation and order. They dropped supplies, not bombs. They mapped the countryside, not targets. The same noise that once meant death now signaled rebuilding. By the end of 1946, most of Japan's warplanes had been scrapped, melted down for metal, recycled into the infrastructure of recovery. Yet in hidden corners of hangars, fragments remained. A propeller blade here, a worn cockpit dial there. To the men who once flew them, these were sacred relics of a time when flight was everything. And though the wings of the empire had been broken, the dream of flight, that deep, unspoken fascination with the sky, was not. It had merely changed form. It was waiting quietly for the right moment to rise again. By 1947, the hangars that once echoed with the sound of war had transformed into workshops of learning. The same men who had once tightened bolts on Zero fighters now calibrated measuring tools for peacetime industries. American officers walked through the facilities not as conquerors, but as instructors, ensuring every trace of militarism was replaced by engineering discipline. The Japanese called this new era Saisei rebirth. It was not just political, it was spiritual. Under the strict oversight of General Douglas MacArthur, Japan's aviation programs were dismantled, but their knowledge was not destroyed. The Americans understood that genius lay in Japan's technical hands. It only needed to be redirected. And so, the war factories in Nagoya and Hamamatsu, once dedicated to fighter production, were converted to civilian industries. Aircraft engineers began designing sewing machines, bicycles, and eventually automobiles. The precision that once guided ailerons and propellers now crafted pistons and engines for peace. For the Japanese pilots, however, the transition was harder. Many of them, grounded for life by Allied prohibition, felt a loss deeper than defeat. The cockpit had been their sanctuary, their expression of freedom. Now they stood on the ground, watching others fly. Americans, often in the very skies they had once defended. Yet even that wound slowly began to heal. In 1952, as Japan regained sovereignty, a small but symbolic permission was granted: the right to build light aircraft for civilian use. It was a quiet milestone, unnoticed by most of the world. But to Japan's aviation community, it was a resurrection. Engineers who had once crafted Zero fighters gathered again, older now, with humbler ambitions. They designed gliders, crop dusters, and small transport planes. One name returned to the forefront: Mitsubishi. The company that had built the A6M0 now produced commuter aircraft. Nakajima, reborn as Fuji Heavy Industries, turned to building the Subaru automobile, its logo of 6 stars a reminder of its aerospace roots. Even as Japan's skies filled again with planes, they carried no weapons, only passengers and hope. For many of the surviving wartime pilots, this transformation was both painful and beautiful. They had once been symbols of destruction. Now their legacy was tied to peace and progress. Some became flight instructors. Others test pilots for the new era. A few even worked with American firms stationed in Japan, helping to maintain and repair aircraft of the U.S. Far East Air Force. It was here, in these quiet post-war exchanges, that something extraordinary occurred, a reversal of roles. Japanese technicians, who once studied American aircraft under occupation, now collaborated as equals. They learned new aerodynamics, new materials, new ways of thinking about flight. The same curiosity that had driven them during the war now propelled them into the future. By the late 1950s, Japan's aviation rebirth culminated in the YS-11, a twin-engine turboprop airliner designed and built entirely by Japanese engineers. Many of its creators had once designed warplanes. Now, for the first time since the surrender, their work lifted Japanese civilians into sky again, not as warriors, but as travelers. When the YS-11 took its maiden flight in 1962, the crowd at the airfield fell silent as the aircraft rose gracefully into the air. Among the spectators were men who had once fought in the Pacific. Some saluted, others simply watched, their faces unreadable. For them, this was closure. A nation that had once measured glory in destruction was now measuring dignity in creation. In American reports, officers noted something remarkable. Japan's post-war recovery in aviation was not driven by military ambition, but by pride and craftsmanship, an echo of the same discipline that once defined its fighter aces. The hangars of defeat had become classrooms of progress. The lessons of war had evolved into the foundations of peace. By the end of the 1960s, when U.S. and Japanese pilots began training together under alliance programs, no one could have imagined that 2 decades earlier they had been mortal enemies. The men who once shot each other were now sharing cockpits, manuals, and stories. For the Japanese veterans, it was not forgiveness they sought, but understanding, and they found it quietly in the shared language of flight. History often measures war by victory and defeat, but in the quiet years after 1945, something deeper took shape, a transformation born not from conquest, but from understanding. The Japanese pilots who once dived into the Pacific believing their cause divine, later stood beneath the wings of their former enemies and saw the truth not through humiliation, but through clarity. The aircraft that had once symbolized terror and loss became symbols of progress, instruments of learning, not vengeance. There's a strange poetry in that. Machines built to destroy became teachers. Enemies became mentors. And in that exchange of knowledge, both sides grew. For the Americans, it was a reminder that mercy after victory can be more powerful than domination. For the Japanese, it was proof that defeat need not mean extinction, that the mind, unlike the nation, cannot be occupied. When Japan's skies filled once again with aircraft, no longer Zeros, but airliners, research planes, and peaceful transports, they carried within them the ghost of a generation who had learned too late what flight truly meant. To fly was no longer to conquer, but to connect. To build was no longer prepare for war, but to preserve the sky for those who would inherit it. In museums across Japan today, preserved Zero fighters stand beside American Hellcats and Corsairs. Their propellers are still. Their engines will never roar again. Yet in their silence lies a dialogue between 2 nations that once fought to annihilate each other, and instead learned to rebuild the world together. A visitor can stand there, between those 2 aircraft, and feel the full arc of history, from destruction to dignity, from rivalry to respect. The war ended long ago, but the skies remember, not the hatred, not the blood, but the courage, the ingenuity, the shared awe of men who dared to master the wind. Because in the end, history is not written by the victors or the vanquished. It is written by those who learn. And among the wreckage of war, the Japanese learned to fly again, not against the world, but with it.